This is the Heroes for Freedom podcast. I'm Rick Robison. Colonel George Rogers Clark defeating the scalp buyer, the British General Henry Hamilton. The British commander, Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton, was not called the Scalp-Buyer General for nothing. He paid local Indian tribes top dollar for American scalps, men, women, even children, or so it was reported. This was a pivotal moment on February 23, 1779, when American Lieutenant Colonel George Rogers Clark and his company of determined American frontiersmen, rangers really, faced the British who occupied Fort Vincennes in what would become southern Indiana, led by the Scalp-Buyer General, Commander Henry Hamilton. This story and many others from the 100 irreplaceable heroes of America's illustrious past are available in the Heroes for Freedom manual series that you see over my shoulder here. Links to these full-color manuals are in the show notes. And also, I'd love to hear from you in the comments, certainly, and your review if you have a moment. Being February 1779, the night was cold and wet. The kind of wet that seeps into your bones. A February night you always hope to spend indoors by a warm fire. Worse, for these American soldiers, the ground was trying to decide if this ankle-deep mud would stay slimy and sticky or if it would freeze solid under their moccasins. Miserable all the way around, in fact. What was worse was that the stakes in the soon-to-come battle were monumental for the fledgling United States of America. George Rogers Clark had been commissioned a lieutenant colonel by Virginia's Patriot governor, Patrick Henry. The men he led, barely 170 strong, were a mixture of Virginia militiamen, frontiersmen, and French volunteers. The British dragoons and their Indian allies who held Fort Vincennes totaled around 300 men. But the Americans believed they were fighting for something more significant than the mud at their feet. They were standing for their neighbors, for each other as a band of brothers. But beyond that, they fought for control of this vast continent that would make their new nation strong and vibrant. Should the British win this engagement, there was no other American force in the West to keep the British from taking it all and, in effect, encircling the fledgling United States, crowding it into the Atlantic seaboard and squeezing America until it collapsed in on itself. Clark and his men understood. The United States could not survive without these critical Western lands, without the resources these lands were producing. But most of all, land a rapidly growing republic would require to survive. Knowing this, of course, the British were determined to maintain control of these western areas of the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, effectively boxing in and forcing America back into the arms of their British overlords. Fort Vincennes, also known as Fort Sackville, was a heavily fortified British outpost on the Wabash River in present-day Indiana. British commander Henry Hamilton planned to use Vincennes as a base to rally Native American tribes against the settlers, against the Americans, keeping the frontier in flames and in fear, and ultimately under British military control. If Lieutenant Colonel George Rogers Clark could take the fort from the British, it would cripple their influence in the region, helping drive the British from these lands. But more so, if the British could somehow be defeated and humiliated before their Indian allies, much of the British support and influence would evaporate in the area. At least that's what Colonel Clark was counting on. And as it turned out, he was right. But taking this heavily guarded fort seemed strategically impossible, particularly in such horrible weather, considering the few men under his command. For in this kind of wet, their flintlock muskets and Kentucky long rifles took extra skill just to keep their powder dry. Clark's men were an eclectic mix of seasoned frontiersmen, as I mentioned, and they were farmers, some of them, and militia, but hardy and exceptionally skilled with the rifle. However, they were also poorly supplied, and they were always, it seemed, hungry. Of course, they were exhausted, too, having marched nearly 200 miles from Kaskaskia, where Illinois would become Illinois, through a hostile wilderness of swamps, rough terrain, and densely packed forests and thickets. Without mercy, the freezing rain had not stopped throughout, forcing the men to wade through chest-deep, frigid creeks and rivers. Incredibly, many of his men were barefoot, their feet battered, swollen, and bleeding. Hunger gnawed at them as rations ran out. They were forced to live off the land. But in winter, it's practically impossible, especially when you've got so many men concentrated in one area. Of course, it was an ordeal that would have broken down and finished lesser men. But George Rogers Clark had trained his boys to be tough, and he inspired them with his unshakable resolve and loyalty. He had taught them himself, and they were determined to follow him into hell and back if necessary. In his talks with them, his sincerity and concern for their well-being had convinced them that this wasn't just any commander leading them into just any other battle in this hard-fought war. No, it was a struggle for the very soul of the revolution, to protect struggling and vulnerable American families trying to get a toehold in the wilderness while being preyed upon by brutal Indian tribes employed by the British, employed to hunt Americans, in effect. As well, they were fighting for their liberties, to freely homestead the wilderness, to cut out farms from the forest with their bare hands. They were all poor for the most part, many former indentured servants to the British, truly with absolutely nothing to go back to. Colonel Clark had given them the opportunity, the uniquely American vision of creating a nation of private cabins, homes, farmsteads, villages, and then someday great cities, offering a livelihood for the millions of Americans who would follow these intrepid trailblazers. Clark had the rare ability to help men see with their spiritual eyes the divine possibilities, at the same time to show his men the evil nature of the British enemy, an enemy that, since it couldn't control America, then it would, it seemed at this point, systematically try to destroy it in its infancy. These stalwart 170 American Rangers had caught the vision that Colonel Clark had presented and were holding on to it with everything they had. As the Americans approached the British-occupied fort of Vincennes, Colonel Clark ordered a calculated deception. He instructed his men to raise a rebellious noise and march back and forth in full view of the British holding aloft nearly 500 regimental flags and banners that they'd brought along for this purpose, making their force appear far larger than it actually was. The British manning the fort began to fear. They hadn't expected an American force until spring. How could they have traveled, these Americans, in such harsh weather and such terrible conditions, and gotten there so fast? British Commander Hamilton tried to calm his increasingly nervous men, but he had really no answers for them. The Americans had seemingly appeared from nowhere. Colonel George Rogers Clark went on the offensive. In the blackness of night, his men silently crept close to the fort, using the heavy rain to cover any possible sound. At dawn, the Americans were now suddenly within striking distance of several vulnerable sections of the fort walls. Colonel Clark sent Commander Hamilton a bold demand for his immediate, unconditional surrender. Hamilton, however, still believed that he had the upper hand since his men were safely inside of a good fort. Clark didn't bat an eye, but signaled for his Rangers to release a skillfully aimed volley of long rifle fire at the British standing above them on the walls. A number of British soldiers suddenly dropped where they stood. The American rifles were really accurate, deadly accurate. Colonel Clark's Rangers, well dug into their strategic positions and fairly close, started picking off the British on the fort's walls with their skilled sniping. Whenever one of Commander Hamilton's British forces, one of his men, would poke his head up to fire his musket, he was shot dead by the Americans. Colonel Clark did not want to be forced to take this next step, but American scouts had captured a group of Indian warriors returning to their people who were in the fort with the British. They were coming from a massacre that they had carried out. It's a massacre party of these Indians. The Indians had attacked a nearby American settlement, killing and scalping many American women and children. Colonel Clark determined that these Indians, who were being paid by the British for these scalps, were not soldiers, but murderers. And so in order to put fear into the hearts of General Hamilton's men on the walls, both British and their Indian allies, and in full view of those manning the walls, Clark tied up the braves and executed each one with tomahawks. The grim display sent an undeniable message to the British. Inside the fort, British morale plummeted. General Hamilton's soldiers, increasingly desperate, began to fear that reinforcements that they'd sent for would never arrive in time. After 2 days of siege, General Hamilton surrendered Fort Vincennes to George Rogers Clark and his men. It was February 25th, 1779. Though generally forgotten to history, there were other, major battles going on in the war at this time, further east. that Americans had most Americans' attention in the seaboard states. But yet, in truth, the American victory at Fort Vincennes was enormous. Though outnumbered, George Rogers Clark's daring and strategic brilliance, in fact, secured the Illinois country for the Americans, halting British efforts to dominate the western frontier and to isolate the eastern seaboard states of the new American Republic. More so, Clark's victory demonstrated to France and to Spain, our allies in the war effort, that the Americans could not only win in the 13 colonies, or the 13 states, but also defeat and clear the British from the Western territories, what was known at the time as the Great Northwest Territory, the lands that would become Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Kentucky, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And they could successfully defend their claims by holding the West for America. Perhaps most importantly, it laid the groundwork for the eventual inclusion of this essential territory within the growing United States of America. George Rogers Clark emerged from the Battle of Vincennes as an American hero of the frontier and the protector of the thousands of stalwart yet highly vulnerable American families that were settling these wilderness regions west of the Appalachian Mountains, particularly in the Kentucky area and others. Truly and rightfully, George Rogers Clark's name is overshadowed by monumental figures such as George Washington, Daniel Morgan, and Nathaniel Greene. Still, his heroic efforts were in many ways every bit as significant, especially for those stalwart Americans, trailblazers, trying to protect their families and build a nation out of a seemingly endless, even deadly wilderness. Colonel George Rogers Clark proved many times that American grit, courage, endurance, and military strategy, certainly skilled military strategy, would triumph in the end, even in the most severe and hopeless of times. I'm Rick Robison, and this is the Heroes for Freedom podcast.